And now it's both my privilege and my pleasure to introduce someone who is changing lives the planet over. Dr. Bruce Lipton. His history is one that's filled with academic start. He's a cellular biologist, and what he teaches is life. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Lipton.
Thank you very, very much. It's a great opportunity for me to come here and spread this information for you because, first of all, I think you're going to find it's very informative and nothing better than most empowering, because there's a whole new understanding going on in the world of biology, and it really relates to our understanding of parenting. And what really gets me into this is that, first of all, I'm a cellular biologist, and my work is, I'm just looking at the technology here, my work at this moment is involved with developmental cellular biology. When I was at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, I was involved with teaching embryology and histology and the understanding of development in general. And so, interestingly enough, my work started carrying on further and further in this field. And I really wasn't actually as motivated to jump into conscious parenting until after I read this article in the New Yorker magazine back in 1998. And this article, Do Parents Matter?, really grabbed me. And it's really based on a book called The Nurture Assumption by Judith Harris. Now, the premise of the book is this, is that Judith raised two kids, her own natural child and an adopted child. And in the process, her own natural child apparently turned out wonderfully beautifully, as she described, and the adopted child became a delinquent and a troublemaker and all kinds of other things. She blamed on this parenting issue on her own parenting skills, and as a result of that, she really held a lot of shame over her parenting. And then at one point she came up into reading psychology. She's not a degreed person, but she was writing textbooks by collecting data, and got into an understanding of psychology that let her see something very different. What she actually started to turn out was the fact that she really said, oh, parents matter less than you think and peers matter more. She got to the point of actually rationalizing the reality of having two different divergent children coming from the same parenting. Well, the problem with that, of course, is she really then tried to tell the public that parents don't matter at all, that anybody could have some kids and all you have to do is send them to the daycare center or send them to child care, send them to school, and everything will be taken care of for you. And I all of a sudden I read this and I went, yikes, I cannot believe this, because it's really, it was just abominable to me as a developmental biologist to hear this, so I really got much more on the bandwagon to come out and try and talk about conscious parenting. And really what it really relates to is this, is that first of all, there is no blame and shame on parenting for the following reason. As a group, as a population, as a nation, we really haven't been given the proper parenting skills to really understand how to do parenting. And therefore, to try and blame yourself for parenting issues without having proper teaching in this area also means there is no blame. There will be after the lecture, though, by the time I tell you how it's done. But no, really what I want to try to tell you is that, first of all, parenting, it's not a list of things to do, and I'm not going to provide a list of things to do. Parenting is a way of life. And I really want to talk about what it really means to be a conscious parent in this regard. And basically what the whole premise of my being up here has to do with this. Psychology is an effort to understand how the nervous system works and behaviorally, and it's based on biology. Well, what's happened in the last few years is that biology has undergone a tremendous renaissance in awareness. And the relevance is psychology has never kept up with it. And so therefore there's this lag space. And so my important contribution, I hope, in this area is if I provide you with the newest understanding of biology, it will preclude our old ideas about a psychology, especially because we've also been raised in a generation or population that is dealing with what is called irresponsibility. That we claim no responsibility, that it's not our issues. If there's anything wrong with our health, it has to do with the body's issues. If there's anything wrong with our behavior, it must be something to do with genetics or some other thing. And as a result, we would like to put aside responsibility. Unfortunately, as the new biology reveals, we are very, very personally responsible. But unless you know that responsibility and how it works, then we're really just walking blindly into the field. So what I'm planning to do tonight is this. The first part is I'm going to talk to you about the new biology and why this is relevant. You have to understand that because once you see how the cells actually work, all of a sudden you say, oh my goodness, our belief in things like genes controlling biology and all this other stuff is not accurate at all. There's a new understanding, and what's really wonderful about it, it is really fully empowering. So let me start off with this. I'm a scientist. I came in through the system of conventional academia. I used to teach and research at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where I said I was teaching in embryology and development and histology. And I also was carrying out research on cloning human cells. And that was really what provided me the insight into how biology actually works, by looking at the mechanisms of individual cells as they express their developmental potential. But as a scientist, I was also groomed with the mission statement of science, which is the conventional belief that science is following right now. And it's interesting because this mission statement of science is actually from 1650, but it's still the very same mission statement. And the mission is to obtain knowledge that can be used to dominate and control nature. This is what the essence of science is trying to do. Unfortunately, now that I really understand a lot more, I realize this is a really scary proposition to be working on. It doesn't work that way. We really should be understanding how we incorporate ourselves in the community of nature, not to dominate nature, but how to participate in the community. And this is also the effort of understanding about parenting, because we are a community of people, and each person is made out of a community of cells. So basically, this was the mission statement of science. And it was really interesting because in order for us to dominate and control nature, the first thing we actually have to do as scientists is identify what is the natural control that exists in biology. For the simple reason is, if I know what the natural control is, then I can manipulate that. So the question that scientists first faced after asking this question in 1650 is, where is the control in biology? Well, interestingly enough, there were two opposing possibilities. One was that the control came from the outside and impressed itself on the cellular mechanisms. And two, the control was from the inside, that within the cell there were chemicals or agents that were responsible for directing its control. Those that believe that the control is from the outside have historically been known as spiritualists. That there's some spiritual entity, a soul, a former, as Plato would have talked about, the reality, something out there giving shape to us. In the contrasting point of view, those that believed that the control was from the inside were actually called mechanists. Why? Because they presumed that the cell was a mechanism, and as such, that the parts of the mechanism controlled the expression of the mechanism. Well, this is an older view of the two potentials, outside and inside control. In more recent years, actually, it's the same idea, but now we talk about the difference between nature and nurture. That we say nature represents some kind of control mechanism present inside the cell that controls the biology. Today, we are actually talking about genes in this regard. Nurture talks about the environment. So basically the difference is this. Are we controlled by the genes from within, heredity, or are we controlled from the environment or some combination? And the interesting thing is, for hundreds of years, this pendulum was swinging back and forth. At some time, nurture was more predominant in belief, and at other times, nature was more predominant in belief. But the pendulum stopped swinging essentially in 1859. In 1859, Charles Darwin presented the world with The Origin of Species, the theory of evolution. And in this, it was totally expressed that the traits that an individual expresses are passed from the parent to the child. Well, as soon as scientists agreed that this was actually happening, then they actually came to the conclusion, then whatever is controlling my traits, my characteristics, must have been physically passed from the parents. That ended the nature of spiritual understanding, because at that point we became very materialistic, because we said we must be able to find what is that physical stuff that's being passed from one generation to the next generation. At the time Darwin started this, we had no knowledge of genes. They were just called hereditary factors at that time. 100 years of focused research by science said, look, we know it's in this material that's being passed. It took 100 years to figure out what it was. And it turns out it's the double helix of DNA. So when Watson and Crick presented the understanding of the genetic code in 1953, all of science said, wow, we finally got it. The secret, the answer to life. It's all in the genes. It's in this stuff that we pass, the hereditary material. Well, the interesting understanding about this hereditary material is that not only does it provide for our structure, but it also presumably provides for our other characteristics. And the flow of information, and this is the important understanding, the flow of information says in biology it unfolds, information unfolds. Where does it start from? Well, it presumably starts from the DNA. And then the information in the DNA blueprint is translated into another molecule called RNA. RNA is like a Xerox copy of the gene. The original DNA stays in the nucleus of the cell. The RNA, the blueprints, leave the nucleus of the cell and then enter into the cytoplasm, where they're used to make the protein. You are a protein machine. This is a fact. You look in the mirror, you want to look at yourself, all of the characteristics that you see are due to the protein molecules that make up your body. Then, in fact, the behavior that you express is from the protein molecules in the body. You are a protein mechanism. Well, the interesting part about this is follows. It says this. This belief became so ingrained that Francis Crick, one of the co-founders of the genetic theory, came up with what he called the central dogma. And what this means is an inviolable truth. Well, the interesting thing about it is this. Dogma is not a scientific term. Dogma is a religious term. And the interesting understanding then says this. The fundamental belief in science is actually a religious belief in the DNA being the source of who and what we are. And all of a sudden, we all bought it. And for years now, since 1953, 50 years of imprinting this belief upon us. It's been printed in every textbook from elementary school up through graduate level education, that what's going on is that the DNA controls who you are. It's actually in textbooks referred to as the primacy of DNA, which means first cause. So whenever you want to find out what about your characters or your traits, the first cause appears to be the DNA. That leads us to the belief in genetic determinism. And the belief in genetic determinism at first was your physical structures were determined by the genes. Now we've transcended that because we're so invested in genes in our world that we now buy that genes are not only for your physical structure, but genes provide for emotional and behavioral characteristics as well. Well, all of a sudden it says then who you are was pre-programmed in your genes. And that's what the concept of genetic determinism means. You are already determined when the sperm and egg come together. Your life is already a program that unfolds after that. Well, in this case, then you understand why when a woman goes for an OBGYN checkup, what is the doctor primarily concerned with? He asks, are you eating well? Are you exercising well? Are you getting enough fresh air? What is he wanting to find out? Well, he wants to find out if you're nourishing this baby that's developing. And that's the only thing he asks. Why is that his only concern? Are you nourishing the baby? And the reason is simply this, is that if the baby's development is genetically controlled, then what does the mother have to do but just feed it? The genes will unfold and express the whole thing. So that in this OBGYN checkup, we're really not asking the mother about her attitudes and her beliefs and her concerns about life, because this genetic thing is developing on its own and all we need is to feed it. So basically you can see why there's a limited participation in the early pregnancy stages. Well, the issue about it is this. If you're controlled by your genes and your fate is determined by your genes, then you all of a sudden, think about this, are a victim of heredity. Why? You didn't select your genes when you got them. You can't really just say, okay, give me another set of genes. You are stuck with the genes that program your life. And since you didn't pick them and you can't change them, then you've got them and you're the victim. And what this has created in our whole world is what? A belief of powerlessness. We're powerless. Look, cancer's running in my family. I now live in fear because at some point I anticipate that this cancer is going to hit me as well. And all of a sudden you find yourself powerless, and then what do we become? Irresponsible. And the reason is why? If you can't do anything about it, then why even make an effort to do anything about it? So we have groomed a very large population of people to feel that they are victims of their heredity and there's nothing they can do about it. Well, science always has an answer because remember, their mission statement was what? To be able to dominate and control nature. Now that we know that presumably the genes control everything and that the genes give you characteristics, then science said we have one last project. It's called the Human Genome Project. And why is this project so important? Well, once I make a compendium, a full list of all the human genes, then if anybody comes in and says, I have a problem with my life, and in fact, they actually thought there were genes, actually still in science journals, happiness genes. So I'll give you that as an example. If you got stuck with a sucky happy gene, then your whole life is going to be, oh man, I can't get happy. Well, you go to the doctor, and presumably if we have the whole list of genes, maybe you can get some genetic engineering, get new happy genes. Well, this is what the intention was of the Human Genome Project. If to make a complete list of all the genes so that if anybody has a problem with their genetics, we can, using genetic engineering, provide them with new genes. So the project gets off the ground in 1989. And here's the beautiful part. Now think about this. They already know how biology works. It's in the central dogma. DNA, RNA, and protein. We already know that. Well, the interesting understanding goes like this. If we already know how it works, then before they even did the project, they actually knew how many genes they were going to find for this reason. Each protein in your body uses a gene as a blueprint. At the time in 1989, when they started the project, it was estimated there were 100,000 proteins in the body. Today, it's probably 250,000 different proteins. But in 1989, they said there were 100,000 different proteins. Well, if I have a gene for each protein, then how many genes does that start off with? And the answer, of course, is 100,000 genes. We already know that. Now, the other thing is they also recognize there are genes that don't make proteins. But these genes regulate the other genes so that there are genes that control genes. And those genes are called regulatory DNA. Back then, it was estimated the minimum number of regulatory genes was 40,000. So when I put that number together, I say, okay, before the project gets off the ground, all these scientists who know how it works say, when the project gets done, we're going to have at least 140,000 genes in our compendium. 10, 12 years of this Human Genome Project, and in 2001, the results are released, and what are they? The answer is not 140,000 genes as anticipated. The answer is 34,000 genes. Now, all of a sudden, you have to recognize this shocked the scientists. In fact, most of these scientists were caught with their pants down, their genes exposed, and they were really much concerned about the reality that they made a mistake. Well, it's a big mistake. The reason is this. 2/3 of the genes that were required don't even exist. And all of a sudden it says, well, what does that mean? The answer is this. We made an assumption that we knew how it worked. We really didn't know how it worked. And to show you that, in the issue of the Human Genome Project in Nature, a Nobel laureate, David Baltimore, he is the geneticist and a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist at that, very prominent in the world, had a special article in the issue of Nature describing the results of the Human Genome Project. And in the conclusion of his results, this is what he writes. But unless the human genome contains a lot of genes that are opaque to our computers, it is clear that we do not gain our undoubted complexity over worms and plants by using more genes. This is the most important paragraph, and it goes, understanding what does give us our complexity, our enormous behavioral repertoire, our ability to produce conscious action, our remarkable physical coordination, our ability to use precisely tuned alterations in response to external variations in the environment, our learning, our memory, need I go on, remains a challenge for the future. The relevance of this article is understanding what does give us our complexity remains a challenge for the future. So it's interesting, after 12 years of the Human Genome Project, the results come in, and what happened in 12 years? We found out we don't know how it works. It doesn't work the way we thought it worked. We cannot be controlled by genes because there are not enough of them. There are other mechanisms of control. And this is the radical change that is coming about in biology to identify what is it that controls biology. Well, just to let you know, the conventional point of view, even after the Human Genome Project, is still the same. This article, which is in the issue of Science, is dealt with nuclear dynamics. Nuclear means the nucleus of the cell, where all the genes are, the dynamics of what was going on in the nucleus of a cell. And this is a whole series of articles on that, and this is the first page, an introduction to introduce the articles that were presented in this section. And it's interesting because the first sentence gives it away right there. And the first sentence says, for higher organisms, the nucleus is the command center of the cell. The nucleus is where all the genes are. Since the genes still presumably control biology, and all the genes are in the nucleus, then the nucleus is given the nature of being the command center, controlling all of cells. Well, the reality is, what does that mean? It means this. In our belief system, the nucleus of the cell, where the genes are, is tantamount to the brain, because the brain is our command center for the human body, the command center for the cell. The nucleus would be tantamount to the brain. I presume that makes sense right there. But now here comes the whole thing that just pulls the rug out of conventional biology. And it's simple. It's a simple logic statement. It goes like this. If you remove the brain from any living organism, there's an immediate and necessary consequence of that action. What is it? Death. Absolutely. Well, here's an interesting point. I remove the nucleus from a cell. The cell doesn't die. It continues living and expressing all of the behaviors it had before. Some cells can live for 2 or more months with no genes in it. The cells are not sitting there. They're moving around. They're eating, digesting food, building their body, negotiating with other cells in the environment, recognizing toxins and predators in the field, and using the appropriate behavior to protect themselves. Essentially, what I'm telling you is this. Without any genes in the cell still has the coordinated behavior of life. It's still a living system, and it's moving and going even with no genes. And there's an important conclusion to that. And the answer is very simply, the nucleus cannot be the brain of the cell because there's apparently still a brain inside the cell even though there are no genes in it. Well, that's the important understanding is, then what controls biology is not the genes. Nope, it's something else. Well, the medical model, which we're all using in our health system right now, is conventional medicine says that you are a biochemical machine controlled by genes. Well, guess what? The medical model, defunct. It cannot be controlled by genes. And so the issue is, what is controlling biology? And all of a sudden, this is very relevant for all of us, because before we stood back and said, the genes were making me do this. Now the question is, what gives us the character and traits of our lives? So I'm going to talk about cells. And now when I'm going to talk about cells in this beginning part, don't get freaky and say, what's he talking about cells? We're people. Let me explain something to you. You might look in the mirror and see yourself as a single entity, but as a cellular biologist, I'm going to tell you that's a mistaken perception for the following reason. You are made out of trillions of cells. Every cell is a sentient living organism. Why? Well, in my research, I used to clone human cells, take them out of a body, put them in a tissue culture dish, and watch them grow and develop and behave. And the reality is they didn't need your whole body to carry out their lives. Here's the point. We have failed to recognize that we actually are not a single entity. We are indeed a community of cells. That when we talk about health and disease, really what you're talking about is the politics of how the cells in the community are getting along or not getting along, as the case may be. So what I want to talk about is how cells work. And the reason why I'm going to bring this up and the relevance of it is this. Important fact. There is no new function in this entire human body that's not already present in every single cell. Every cell has every system that you express in your body. That has a digestive system, respiratory, nervous system, cardiovascular system, musculoskeletal system, a nervous system, immune system, an endocrine system. It's all in there. So why this is important is you can understand the human by studying the cell, because the human is just collective amoebic consciousness. We are all these amoebas that have come together to share their lives and give us the characters and traits that we express. We cannot express a trait that a cell cannot express because we're made out of cells. So talking about cells will give you insight into your own life. How do cells work? Well, I will show you this little model. And if you could understand what this model represents, then you can understand all about biology. And it works like this. Here's a mechanism. It's got gears that drive. Can you understand that the gears that drive, when they engage, I can connect them to do different things? I can make the gears drive a clock. I can make the gears drive wheels and make a motor out of it. I can make the gears drive a wearing blender so you can have juice in the morning. Basically, the gears are a mechanism, and I can design the mechanism to create any particular function. So the mechanism is the gears, but you need a drive force. The force, like a motor, to make the gears move. Otherwise, it'll be like a watch that's unwound. It'll just sit there. It won't do anything. So life has force to move the gears. But you don't want the gears running all the time. You want to regulate them. So you want some things to be turned on and some things to be turned off. So what do we need? A switch. And then, in addition to that, most good machine mechanisms also come with a gauge to give you a value of the performance of how it's operating and how it's running. So I ask you simply, can you understand how this thing works? I push the switch, the motor turns, moves the gears carry out a function, and in the process I can watch the gauge and see the character quality of the machine. That so far makes simple sense. Well, now, using this, let me explain piece by piece the biology by explaining each one of these, okay? Number one, what controls this mechanism? Now, you look at this picture. Anybody want to offer a suggestion? Yell it out, please. Anybody? It's very quiet.
Feedback.
Feedback, well, that's one source. Thought. Well, how about this machine that we're looking at?
Pushing the button.
Pushing the button. The switch would be like the control, right? This is our belief system and has been, but here's the point. It's not really the control. It's a way of controlling it for the reason is this. I could have this mechanism sit here all the time, but if nobody pushes the button, then it just will sit there. So the control is not the button itself. The control is what pushes the button. See? And why that's relevant is we keep studying the mechanism, but we fail to understand who is actually pushing the button. And I'm certainly going to try and explain that in the next few minutes. So, first of all, let's explain the mechanism. The mechanism is this. This is the mechanism, your human biology. I told you the mechanism is what? Made out of proteins. Well, an interesting understanding of the mechanism, I'll use this picture of the transmission out of my car. And the reason why is what it shows, this is called an exploded diagram, and briefly what you really understand about an exploded diagram is this, is that this mechanism is made out of hundreds of different parts, each part with its own shape and unique structure, and the structures integrate with each other, and when you put them all together, they create the function of the transmission. And so basically it says a lot of parts come together, each part being different, but they integrate to make a functional mechanism. The point? The biology of the cell has over 100,000 different parts that make it up. Each part has a different shape, structure, and function. The parts are called proteins. All these proteins integrate, just like in the transmission, they integrate, engage with each other, and carry out their functions. What's different about the parts in the transmission and parts in the cell is organic. The parts are organic. They don't look like man-made gears and nuts and bolts. They have an amorphic look, a natural biological look to them. So the proteins, although they don't look the same as gears, they actually function the same as gears. So let me give you an example of a protein. This protein in your body, in every one of our bodies, is all the same. It's called calmodulin. It has a unique three-dimensional shape to it. And the question is, what gives each protein, because each protein has its own unique shape, where is the shape, where does it come from? And the answer is, surprisingly enough, underneath the structure is a backbone. And it's just like your own backbone gives you your shape, and you can change your shape, see, moving around by changing the backbone. There's a backbone inside the protein. Very simply, let me explain this. With over 200,000 different proteins, I can tell you this. Although there are 200,000 different ones, they all share the same structural foundation. All proteins are linear strings. They're beaded strings where the beads represent amino acids. So when you're in the health food store and you're buying amino acids, you're buying the component beads that make the proteins in your body. There are over 21 different amino acids that are naturally used in biology. And the fact is, this is misleading because this is kind of a flexible backbone, doesn't have any rigidity. So I'm going to show you using these models as pipe fittings right here as models of amino acids. Imagine 21 different shapes. I'm only showing you 3. The 3 shapes are a 45-degree angle, or excuse me, a 90-degree angle, a 45-degree angle, and a straight one. So that's 3 out of 21 possible shapes. Now, how do they work? Well, they're like poppet beads. They plug into each other. So as I plug them in, all of a sudden you start to see I'm creating a chain, but the chain is very rigid. It's not like the poppet bead chain I just showed you a minute ago. And as I assemble this, we're creating a rigid backbone that will give the shape to a protein. Okay? So here's the way I assembled it this way. Simple question. Very simple. If I disassemble this and reassemble it using a different sequence, will I get the same shape, yes or no? No. And so what's different between all of the proteins? The sequence of the amino acids that make up the chains. And there are 21 different ones. So therefore you can imagine the great variety of different shapes that all the proteins have. And that's why we have so many different ones. Okay? So now we understand that the backbone is really giving the shape to it. Then I want to say this. Can you understand how this metal machine works? It's called a watch. Can you understand that gear A, when it turns right here, moves gear B? When gear B turns, it turns gear C? Does that all make sense to you? Well, if that makes sense, how about if I do this? I throw proteins on top of the gears. Now, they don't look like gears to our normal perception, but if we recognize they're organic gears, can I ask you a question now and say, can you see that if a protein A turns, it will turn protein B, and when protein B turns, it turns protein C? Does that make sense to you? Well, then all of a sudden I say, cool, because what I'm going to do is remove the metal. And now what do we have? Protein gears. And all of a sudden you already said, well, yeah, protein A turns B, turns C. Now you recognize this is how the machinery of the cell works. Now we have all different kinds of groupings of proteins, and they're grouped together in what are called pathways. Meaning, I have digestive proteins, I have respiratory proteins, I have neural proteins, I have muscular proteins, I have bone proteins. So there are different proteins. When they group themselves together to carry out a function, the group that carry out the function is called a pathway. So a digestive pathway would imply what? A machine made out of protein gears whose function is digestion. Okay? So basically, this is the fundamental nature of how the cell is assembled. Now, the gears alone don't move. So we have to cause them to move. We need a motor or a force. Now, I'm offering something special in the lecture tonight because I didn't tell you, but I will tell you now the secret of life. This is the special addition to the lecture. What is the secret of life? And the answer is this. Life is movement, action, motility, animation. Death is stillness, nothing moving. And the difference is, well, what causes life? Where's the motor? Here's the important understanding. The motor is built into the protein itself. I'll explain it to you. Consider this model we just created. And I'm going to give you a fact. I'm going to say that the 2 yellow amino acids at the ends are negatively charged. Both of them are negative. And the question is this. If both of these are negative, is this shape, or conformation in protein talk, is this shape or conformation more stable or less stable than this shape? Which is the more stable, this one or this one? This one. And the reason why simply is this. If 2 things are negative, they repel each other. Like charges repel. So the idea is when I assemble this, these 2 amino acids at the ends would like to be further apart from each other. So this, you're right, is more stable. Now, the secret of life. This. What's this? Well, in this case, it's going to be a positive charge molecule. Actually, if I value it, it's got more positive charge in this than there is negative in this. Now imagine if this positive charge is floating by, what's going to happen when the positive charge gets near the negative end? It'll be attracted and bind. Now, the question is this. What's the charge at this end of the molecule? What's the charge at this end of the molecule? Is this stable, this configuration, or is this one more stable? Okay. And that was the secret of life. Oh, you didn't see it, did you? Let's do it again. Works like this. Works simply like this. Take this off. What's going to happen to the shape? It's going to rotate back. Okay? This is still, it's not moving. Could be dead. I don't know. But guess what? As soon as I attach this, then what does it do? It moves. It moves. The force to make it move is built right into the protein itself. And it's mediated by this. Changing the charge causes the protein to change its charge, and as a result, the backbone moves. Movement is life. When the proteins engage, the gears start to move and then start to do their job. So the question is, what actually causes life? Well, two things. A, the protein, but that alone is not sufficient. The reason? You need the switch. There's something here to actually cause it to change the shape. In this case, the signal is what it is. Does that make sense now? So where does life come from? This would be the normal configuration of this particular assembly. Binding the positive charge to this negative end causes it to move. Movement is animation. Movement is force. Movement drives the system. The motor is built right into the protein itself. So let me just give you an example. That calmodulin we looked at. Well, there's a part of the calmodulin here where you can see the coils like these. They're called alpha helices. They're coils. They're rigid. And there's rigid. But part of the chain is kind of flexible. And that flexible place is like a hinge. So what happens if I change the charge? And now this is the actual movement of the calmodulin molecule in your body. This is the way it moves when the charge is changed on it. And this is when it's doing its work. It's like a little machine, and it's moving. And when you integrate it with all the other gears, it will engage the whole pathway to carry out its function. So we go back to our mechanism. I say, where's the motor? And the fact is, I'll tell you where the motor is. The motor is actually built right in to the protein itself, so there's no extra motor on the outside. It's built in, and now the gears run. Okay? Well, we have a problem with this, and the reason is they'll just keep running and running and running, and so I can't use that. I need to be able to stop it and then turn it on when I need the process and turn it off when I don't need the process. So let me explain. Here's another molecule. It's not the calmodulin. This is called an annexin, and it's got the same backbone. It's not the same backbone, but you can see there's a backbone structure, a lot of rigid areas, and some more flexible areas right here. Well, what's different about this molecule is this one is activated by an actual chemical signal. No life, no behavior. Chemical signal, that's the signal, comes in. The signal binds. Protein plus signal gives you behavior. When the signal disconnects, no behavior. So what makes life work? Add the signal. Controlling the signal will control the function. Bind it, behavior. When the signal comes off, no behavior. So basically, I can turn the gears on and off by regulating the so-called signal. Okay? So I go back to my mechanism. I say, look, let's use this key up here as the signal. Okay? And so they say, well, when I want the gears to work, I provide the key. And when I provide the key and it plugs into the protein, just like this protein signal right here, when it binds, all of a sudden, it will cause the gears to move. Okay? And here's the other one. It just show you all I need is another signal. And every time I provide a signal, the gears start to move. And when the signal comes off, the gears will stop at some point, okay? So controlling it is using the signals. So let's understand something first right here. Proteins make the structure. But when I add a signal, which can be molecules or energy, and this is a new understanding because conventional biology only says molecules are signals. And this is a very important error because that's an old belief. With the new physics, quantum physics, we understand that energy is actually 100 times more active in signaling than our molecules. Energy, your thoughts are energy. That's part of it. The fields that you live in are energy. So you're moving in fields or signals that can regulate your biology. So when the signal shows up, the signal binds to the protein. And when it binds to the protein, it changes the structure, and that causes the function. And we see the function. We call it behavior. So the behavior your biology is expressing is what? The behavior is the gears moving in response to the signal. So the last part I want to talk about before I really get to the switch part is this. There's a gauge. It's called performance. Think about it this way. In your car, a vehicle, a mechanism, gears and all that stuff, there are gauges on the dashboard. And the performance of your car is indicated by the gauges. And if something goes out of whack, you can see the gauges move. So for example, if you are driving your vehicle and the temperature gauge starts going up into the hot zone and it starts to overheat, what would you do? Okay, you don't want to answer that. Okay, I'll answer it for you. What you would do is presumably pull the vehicle over and let it cool down. Why? You use the gauge to see how the performance is, and then you have to adjust according to what the gauges say. Well, the issue about it is this. We all have gauges on our performance. These gauges represent emotions and symptoms. When you have an emotion, it's, let's say, anger. That's the equivalent of the heat gauge. When you get angry, your gauge is going up into the hot zone. What do we normally do? Well, when it comes to anger, we don't do like we do with a car. Usually when you get angry, what do? Is get more angry. You don't stop, cool down, and then let it get back into shape again. Why? We haven't noticed that the feelings and the emotions that we're expressing actually represent feedback to tell you about the performance. More importantly, the symptoms that we feel when we're not being well. What is a symptom? It's a gauge. It's telling you something's wrong with the vehicle, and it's trying to get your attention so you would drive the vehicle in a different manner. The problem that we have in the world today is this. The pharmaceutical industry, your friends, help you. What do? You have a symptom, and what do they give you? A drug, and what does the drug do? Shuts off the symptom. Now you don't have to pay attention to it. It reminds me when I was going to graduate school, I worked in a Chevy dealership. And I remember it was a Friday afternoon, about 4:30, all the mechanics had cleaned up their bays, everybody was ready to go home, and a woman came in and she was irate. She had already been in twice for the same issue. The service engine light on her dashboard, her gauge kept flashing, service the engine, something's wrong. Well, she was like, that's the second time I've already brought it in, now there's a third time and it's still doing this. At 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, who wants to work on that, right? Well, everybody was quiet except for one mechanic. He said, I'll take care of that. And everybody looked at him and thought, man, what's he going to do? There's no time to work on this. It could take hours to fix this. He drives the car back into the bay, and he gets in underneath the dashboard, and he pulls the light bulb out. And then after that, it only took 2 minutes, so what does he do? He has a cigarette, another can of soda, 5 o'clock. He drives it out in the front, and he says, it's fixed. And the woman gets in the car, and she says, oh, wonderful. The light's not saying service engine now. And she drives off very happily. What's the point about that? When we go to a medical doctor and have our symptoms taken away, what we're losing is the gauge that was telling us that our performance was off. And this is what we have to pay attention to. Okay? Well, I'm really getting to this. Why? Because this is the control, the switch. What gives us our behavior and controls our behavior? And the answer is there's an actual switch to control behavior. If I put all the proteins of the cell, all those pathways, respiration, digestion, excretion, in a test tube, the same proteins are in the cell. This is alive. This is not alive. It's just a mixture of chemicals. What's the difference between the two? And the answer is control. In here, I can control when the pathways are active and turn them on and turn them off, and I can't control it in there. What makes the control of your biology? And the answer is the brain. But in the case of the cell, it's actually the membrane. The membrane of the cell is what controls it. The membrane's the skin of the cell. Now, let's take a look at it. Here are my proteins that we talked about before. And my proteins, where are they present? They're inside the cell. So when I look at them, I say, oh, well, around the outside of the cell is the skin, just like your skin. And the signals that control it come from the environment. So the signals have to go through the membrane before they can engage the system. So this area here represents where the switch is. Because if I let the signals in, then I can regulate it. So the membrane, the skin, is the brain because it has the switches in it. Very interesting point. In embryology, the brain of the human is derived from the skin. And the reason is that the skin is the interface between the outside world, the environment, and the inside world of biology. So the skin is the barrier. It's your brain. So looking at the cell, how does your brain work? It's a model of this brain right here. It's all built on the same system. So how does it all work? It works like this. Inside the cell are the protein pathways. Outside of the cell are the signals that control the proteins. For the signal to activate the protein, it has to hit the membrane where there's a switch. The switch at the cell membrane converts the environmental signal into a signal that engages with the protein and makes behavior. It's the environment that engages your behavior. You are controlled by what you see outside in the environment. And the interesting part about the switch is it takes a primary signal called the environmental signal, and the switch converts it into a biochemical signal that will engage with the protein that is called the secondary signal. What does the switch look like? And we're almost finished with the biology. What does the switch look like? It looks like this. Two components. One is called a receptor. The other is called an effector. The receptor sees the environmental signals, and then when it sees a signal, it engages this protein, which generates the signal that controls behavior. Now, do you have receptors? Come on. Where are they? Name some. Just right off the top of your head. Name them. Eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch, pain, pressure. Where do you think all these receptors are that I just talked about? They're in your skin. The eyes are developed from the skin. The tongue, this is developed from the skin. The touch receptors, the pain and heat, they're all in your skin. So again, get the parallel. You and the cell are not that different. You look slightly different, but you have the same mechanisms going on. And the reality is, so when light comes into your eye, the eye converts it into a nerve vibration that sends it into the brain. So the eye sees the light and then converts it in a secondary signal that goes inside and regulates the brain. Okay? Well, this would be the equivalent of the eyes and the ears and the nose of the cell. It sees the environment. When a signal is received, it connects to this guy, which engages the signal to control the biology on the inside. So to show it to you how it works, let me just show you a switch. This is the signal receiver, the eye. This is what generates the secondary one, but when no signal is there, they're not connected. This is the connector. In order for this connector to work, a signal has to show up. What happens when a signal binds to a protein? Remember? Changes the shape. When the signal is there, then what happens is the primary signal is picked up, and the secondary signal is created by this. Primary signal picked up, secondary signal is what drives the biology. When the signal goes away, this thing disconnects and no switch. So I activate the switch by what? The environmental signal activates the switch. Important to recognize, the control of your biology is not on the inside. The control of the biology is from the outside. It's the environment that you live in. So we got down to the nitty-gritty now, and it goes like this. This is the molecular switch that controls the gears with their motors to make everything work. And the switch is two parts, a receptor and an effector. And I could say, well, the switch is the receptor slash effector. Or I can name it by what it does. So I say, what's the function of the receptor? The receptor, like eyes, ears, nose, is awareness of the environment. That's what receptors do. What's the function of the effector? Well, that converts the signal into a physical response. So I say, the effector makes a physical sensation after the receptor receives the signal. I hope that makes sense. Why is this important? Because, number one, do you recognize what this is? This is a critical nature right here. This is the switch that controls the biological mechanisms. There's 100,000 of these switches, different ones on the surface for each of the different functions we got. But I want to give you the name for the switch because there's a name in the dictionary that was there long before I knew the switch existed. What is the switch? Well, what's the definition of the switch? Awareness of the environment through physical sensation. I go to the dictionary, and there it is, the word perception. Perception. Awareness of the elements of the environment through physical sensation. What's the switch that controls your biology? Perception. It's how you see the world. As you see the world, you adjust it. If there's something scary, that's a switch, and it causes your biology to respond in fear. If there's something warm and loving, that's a switch, and it gives you warm, loving growth processes inside your body. Perception is what controls your biology, not genes, which is very important because each of us sees the world slightly differently, don't we? We all have different perceptions, and these are the perceptions that drive our biology. So when I put my flow chart back together again, we knew that the signal altered the protein, changing the structure, leading to its function, which is behavior. But now we know this. The environment is the source of the primary signal, and then the membrane is where the switch is, and the membrane generates the secondary signal, which then drives the protein, et cetera, et cetera. And the point about it is this. The environment is our source. The environment is what we really are. We are made in the image of that environment. And the reality is the environment is the source, and the membrane is the perception switch. The membrane has perception of what's going on and adjusts the behavior. Perception drives behavior. Okay? Well, I told you before, well, let me conclude with this. Perception controls behavior. Perception controls behavior. Okay? But here's an interesting point. I said there were probably over 200,000 different proteins that make up a human body. The proteins are the mechanism. Not all the proteins are always present. Sometimes a signal comes from the environment and I don't have the protein present in my cell right then at that moment. Can I make the protein? Yes. Where do I get the plans to make the protein? And the answer is the DNA. Now we bring the DNA in. Why? What's the function of the DNA? The DNA is the blueprint to make the proteins. And proteins wear out, and that's why I need the DNA. So when I wear out a protein, I can make replacement parts. The proteins are created from DNA blueprints. So how does the DNA work, though? This is, now again, we always thought the genes activate themselves. We always say, you've heard this, a cancer gene turned on. You've heard something like that, I'm sure. The reality is this, a cancer gene cannot turn itself on. This is a biochemical fact. Genes, this is a fact. Genes cannot self-activate. A gene cannot turn itself on. If you actually had a cancer gene and it really created cancer, when would you express that cancer? And the answer is, at the moment you were born, you would already have the cancer. Why? The gene would have created it. You cannot have a cancer gene in your body, then say at some point the cancer gene turned itself on. You can have an abnormal gene in your body, and then when you turn it on, it didn't turn on by itself. It was turned on by the environment or your perception of the environment. Cancer is a perception of trying to deal with a hostile or environment that doesn't support you in some way or other, okay? Well, how does a gene work? And this is the beautiful part. How a gene works, and the answer is this. Inside the nucleus of the cell, and this is a special technique where you can stain all the chromosomes which are inside the nucleus. And so when I open up the nucleus after staining it, that's when you see the chromosomes. You have two sets of chromosomes, one from your mother and one from your father. And this technique allows you to stain the pairs. You have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each of the different pairs has a different color, and that's how you can match them up. But the issue is this. What am I staining? Well, it's very important. And the issue is we know that the nucleus is 50% DNA and 50% protein. But the issue is this. We didn't know what the protein did for 50 years. You know why? Very simple reason. In 1953, when we decided genes control biology, and they'd isolate the chromosomes and get the genes, they threw away the protein for 50 years. The reason is this. Who needs to study the protein when you're studying the DNA? So they threw it away. And after 50 years, some people started to get wise and go, 50% is a lot of protein in there. What do you think the protein's doing? Boy, that was one of the most important changes in the current issues of biology today. What is the protein doing? Let me explain it to you. The protein forms a sleeve around the DNA. The DNA is not free in the nucleus. It's covered by a sleeve of protein. They're called regulatory proteins. Great name. Now you might get the idea. How do they regulate? And it goes like this. It's called epigenetic control. It's a new word. Epi means above. We now recognize there's a control above the genes that controls the genes. The genes aren't controlling themselves. And so basically, what are the genes? The genes are just blueprints for the proteins. But how do you know which proteins you want? It's not up to the genes. It's up to epigenetic regulation, which is the environment controlling gene activity. It's the environment that controls the genes. How does it? Nucleus doesn't know what's going on. The environment tells the nucleus. How does it do it? This is the beautiful part. It's so simple. It goes like this. Imagine my bare arm as a gene. And if I wrote the genetic code for, let's say, blue eyes on my arm, the little bases, the DNA bases, and I'd ask you a question. If you could see all the bases, I'd say, right now, can you read the gene for blue eyes, yes or no? Yes. Okay, but I said, well, wait, what does the DNA look like when it's back in the nucleus? Because this is not the natural situation. Oh, back in the nucleus looks like that. Can you read the gene for blue eyes, yes or no? If you want to read the gene for blue eyes, what do you got to do? Take the cover off. What's the cover made out of? Protein. And what causes a protein to change shape? The perception, the signal. The signals cause it to come off, and the signals allow you to read the gene. The gene didn't read itself. So how does it work? It works simply like this. Inside the nucleus of the cell are chromosomes, which are DNA strands covered up by proteins. At the beginning of each different gene segment, there's a special protein called a regulatory protein. What activates the regulatory protein? A signal. If a signal binds to a regulatory protein, it causes it to change shape. And when it does that, it causes the DNA to be exposed. So basically, how does it work? It works like this. Chromosome, DNA inside. Here comes an environmental signal from perception. Binds to this particular protein, which activates this particular gene. How does it activate the gene? The answer is the protein changes its shape, and all of a sudden, guess what? Now the gene is exposed. Now you could read the gene. Before you couldn't read it. Reading the gene is a process called transcription. And what is it? It's a protein that will come up here and make a copy of this DNA strand. This copy is called messenger RNA. That is the blueprint that will go into the cell so I can make the protein that it needs. And when I have the blueprint, I don't need the DNA anymore, so the signal pops off, and guess what? Boom! Covered up the gene. Relevance about all this? What controls genes? Perception controls genes. It's how you see the world that controls the genes in your body. Why this is relevant? Abnormal perceptions, misperceptions, by definition, will select inappropriate genes and inappropriate functions in your body. So perception becomes the important point. But what about our dogma? Central dogma, DNA, RNA, and protein, primacy of DNA? The answer is it's incomplete. Why? Add the regulatory proteins, the epigenetic control. But do you also know you can't remove the regulatory proteins till you have what? Environmental signal. And all of a sudden you see it's the top of the flow is not DNA. It's not the primacy of DNA. What is it? The primacy of the environment. It's your interaction in the environment that selects your gene programs. If you're in a very supporting, nurturing environment, you'll express functions of the system to promote growth. But if you're in a toxic, angry creating environment, an environment that conflicts with your life, you're going to select different programs. Well, let's talk about this here for the reason is now that we know that perception controls genes, we can put these two things together. We can say perception controls behavior because the signals from the environment engage the mechanism. Perception controls genes because the signals from the environment expose the DNA. So perception controls biology. This is the important understanding. Perception controls biology. Well, let's talk about this perception business for a second. At the surface of the cell, those are the switches called perception. These switches respond to the signals, and they engage the behavioral mechanism of the cell. It's your perception that controls this biology. Well, the relevance about that is, let me tell you two important characters about perception. Perception, number one. Perception represents a unit of awareness. Very simple. Here's a perception of an apple. This is a perception of a pear. Oh, I have different perceptions. Each perception identifies something in the environment. Here's a perception of my mother. Here's a perception of my father. That's two different perceptions. Each one is a unit of awareness. But, now this is critical, perceptions are also given a survival value. Each perception you see influences your life. And so there's a value when you learn about that perception, you give it a value of whether it's supporting your life or something that threatens your life. And that's very important because ever after that, when you see that perception again, you will automatically say, oh, I remember that threatened me. Or this was a great thing. I love that. And so what is loving or hating or fearing something? These are the values of the perception that you've acquired. You learn these perceptions. This is very important. What are the perception values? Well, basically, at the fundamental level, there are two values to perception. One, perceptions that provide for growth and reproduction. Things in your environment that nourish you, encourage you to thrive in the world, you give them a growth value to them. And you engage in behaviors of growth. Growth is opening up your arms and taking it in. Growth is things that are out there giving you sustenance and supporting your life. But you need other mechanisms of survival besides growth. You have to understand protection. They involve different activities. Growth is encouraging the system to facilitate its own homeostatic balance. Protection, you don't go into protection like, hey, open your arms up. What do you do in protection? You close them down. Interesting. Growth, open. Protection, closed. Everything that you've identified in your life that threatens you, a perception, when you experienced it, you gave it a value of whether you thought it was promoting your life or taking away from your life. So why is that important? Because after you learn it the first time, if it comes again, you're already prepared to make the appropriate response. So every perception you have supports growth or protection. Does it take energy to grow? Does it take energy to protect yourself? Very important point. The reason is this. If you engage in a lot of protection, where do you get the energy from to do that? You take it away from growth. In other words, you can't fund everything infinitely, so the more protection you think you need, the more you engage in protection, the more you have to shut off growth. So the simple truth about survival is this. Survival is equal to growth divided by protection. And in this world, as you can see in the last year or so, what is happening to our needs? We are living in this. Why is this important? Because the more we do this, the less we do of that. It's just a matter of mathematics. You have a checkbook, you have a balance, you write checks for protection. And as every time you write a check for protection, the budget balance drops, and it gives you less for growth. And the problem is, do we need to have all the protection that we are told we need to have? And the answer is absolutely not. It's a belief system. People are making money from it. And the reality is, if you would take back the effort you put into protection, you know how your life would expand and grow? And the reason is why? You're just fiddling away all your energy trying to protect yourself. From what? Ghosts, goblins, real things? Let me explain something that's so fundamental that it was so simple and profound, it just like stopped me in my tracks. I cloned human cells. That's what I was doing. And I can tell you a simple experiment. In the Petri dish, I have my cells, and in front of this cell, I put some nutrients. In another Petri dish, in front of the same kind of cells, I put toxins. I know exactly where the cells are going to be when I come back in an hour or two. And the answer is illustrated. After a period of time, cells will move toward the growth nutrients for growth, opening and going toward. But in regard to toxins, what do? Back up, close away, and move the opposite direction. Does that make sense? Well, then look at this. Cells cannot move in both directions at the same time. Relevance? When you're in protection, you cannot grow. The cells can't do it. Cells in protection close themselves off. Cells in growth open themselves up. And why this is relevant is it's the perceptions of the environment that are stimulating growth or protection. It's our perceptions that make that decision. Important simple point. Just give you the simple analogy. We live in a community, the old days back when we thought the Russians were going to bomb us. We built bomb shelters. Okay, beautiful summer day like today. The community is working and growing. The factories are going. People are going to school. The whole community is in a stage of growth. An air raid siren goes off. What does everybody do then? They go down into the bomb shelter. Simple question. When the community is in the bomb shelter, is the community in growth? No, it's in protection. And if they say all clear, everybody comes out, and guess what? You can go back on the job, and then we're back in growth again. That's called an acute response. Here's the problem. It's called a chronic response. What does a chronic fear do? The air raid siren goes off, you go into the bomb shelter, and there's no all clear. That's what a chronic fear is. And why is that important? How long can you survive in the bomb shelter? After a while, you're going to run out of the food and the things you need, and you're not growing anymore. So the more fear you're in, the more you shut your system down. The more you shut your system down, the less growth. And growth is not just from a neonate to an adult. A growth behavior is required every day of your life for the simple reason. Every day of your life, you're losing millions and billions of your cells. If you don't replace them, after a short period of time, the attrition will cause a breakdown of the mechanism and disease. The more fear that you live in, the more protection you hold, the less growth you express, and the more susceptible you are now for disease. Because what have you done? Shut down the system. Everybody needs to grow every day, and fear shut off growth. Okay? So when I look about cells, I give you a simple understanding. Cells move toward or attracted to positive growth-promoting signals. Cells move away from, have an aversion to, or repulsion from signals that are recognized or perceived as being negative and life-threatening. And they get into protection. Growth is toward the signal. Protection is away from the signal. Just to let you know, there are some signals that are irrelevant. They're just background. So you can have a perception of things that are really not going to be growth-oriented or fear-oriented. They're just some things that are out there, background noise. Interesting point, this is exactly the same as a human, except the human has a graded scale. I was looking at individual cells. Now I'm looking at 50 trillion cells. And 50 trillion cells, I could have some percent in growth and some percent protection. But guess what? Same thing, humans and cells. Anything that supports your growth, you will move toward it with open arms. You will go out and get it. And the most important growth factor for a human being is love. Love is what provides harmony to the system. Love is an energy that coordinates and makes the community a whole functioning system. Fear causes the system to pull itself apart and go into protection. Fear gives you this movement. Anything you fear, you get away. You have an aversion for that. You don't want to be there. You will close yourself down. And just like cells, there are some things in life that don't make any difference one way or the other. And it's a graded response. I like something, that's this much. I love something, that's that much. Okay? So the reality is, what does it mean? All the perceptions that you have learned from the time you were actually a prenate, and I'll talk about that, you acquired a value for everything that's in this world. And every time you experience whatever is out there, you will use the value you've ascribed to it to control your behavior. So you have learned perceptions. So let me tell you, there's a switch in your body that actually controls this growth protection. It's called, fancy name, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Really, it's simple. The hypothalamus is the portion of the brain that remembers the values of perceptions. The hypothalamus says, oh, I remember that. That was scary. Oh, I remember that. I love that. The hypothalamus determines the value of the perception. If the hypothalamus says, oh, I perceive something that's stressful, then what's the system want to do, growth or protection? Well, protection. So what's it going to do? It's going to say, okay, I saw that this was negative, so what I'm going to do is now talk to the pituitary gland. If you remember, in pituitary gland, it doesn't have to be in college. It was a grade school thing. The pituitary gland is called the master gland. Reason? I have 50 trillion cells in here. The pituitary gland is like the government saying, okay, this is our move. This is what we're going to do. Coordinate the 50 trillion cells. So the pituitary gland gets a signal that it's stressful. And the pituitary gland says, okay, let's get this engagement for protection. Well, when things threaten me from the outside, which protection system do I use in my body? Grade school name was called fight and flight. The adrenal system. When you get your adrenal glands working, you're ready to fight or flight. That's ready to move and go do something about it. So it's interesting. The signal goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. Pituitary says, I command all the cells to get into protection. And it does it by sending a signal down to the adrenal gland. That's where that comes in. The adrenal glands release the adrenal hormones for fight or flight. The relevance about it is this. Think about it. If I'm going to be in fight or flight, am I going to use my viscera or am I going to use my arms and legs? Arms and legs. So you know what the first thing that the adrenal hormones do? They squeeze the blood vessels shut in the viscera to force the blood to go to the arms and legs so I can run. Simple point. If I shut off the blood flow to the viscera, what does that mean about growth? Growth is inhibited because the viscera is responsible for growth. If you don't give it blood, no growth. Where's the blood? It's getting ready to run. So you shut down growth. That's the first thing you do when you get under stress. Number two, if I'm, running away from a lion that's chasing me and I have a bacterial infection, there's another protection system. Now it's called the immune system. The immune system is protecting me from the lion or the bacteria? From the bacteria, from the interior stuff. Which is more important, fight the bacteria or run away from the lion? The system knows this, and you know what? The stress hormones, this is a beautiful point, the same stress hormones that shut down the viscera and force the blood to the periphery, those stress hormones cause the immune system to shut itself off. Why? Conserve energy to run away from a lion. Relevant? We live in a stressful world out there. And right now, when we have high adrenaline levels, we are naturally shutting off the immune system. Interesting point. The medical profession uses these very same glucocorticoid hormones to shut off the immune system in people who receive transplants of organs and tissues. Reason? They don't want the immune system to reject it, so you shut it off. How? Give it stress hormones. Well, what does that mean when you're under stress? You shut off your own immune system. That's when you start to get sick fast. That's like at the end of the semester when kids get sick around exam time. Now they're stressed out. Now they shut off the immune system. Now they're susceptible to what's out there to get them. And then I always like to add the last, I call it the insult to injury, and it goes like this. If you're running away from a lion, stressful adrenal system, are you going to use executive reasoning and logic, or are you going to use hindbrain reflex behavior? The important point about it is this. You know the hormones? I said they squeeze the blood vessels to force the blood to the periphery. The same hormones squeeze the cerebral blood vessels, forcing the blood to go to the hindbrain so you engage in reflex behavior, not thinking. Point? When you're under stress, you're less intelligent. And the world, we are becoming less intelligent as a group because of the stresses that we're under. We're not thinking clearly. In school, we call it exam stress. Exam stress, try to think of an answer. You can't, because the answer comes from reasoning and logic. And when you're under exam stress, all you're thinking about is running out of the exam room going, ah! And so right away, you're not working on logic. And so the point is, what happens to us when we live in this world under stress? We shut off our growth, we shut off our immune system, and we shut down our intelligence. It's not a great combination of events. Okay? Okay. Now comes this really interesting part. I said the perceptions run the program. Where do the perceptions come from? Aha! First of all, the first perceptions that we acquire are genetic. They're instincts. A child knows how to suckle. You don't have to teach it that. An infant will pull its hand out of the flame. You don't have to teach it that. It's built into the system. We acquire through genetics basic perceptions that are used by all humans no matter what period of history they're in. The same instincts that we are using today were provided to humans 500,000 years ago and will likely be provided genetically to future people 500,000 years from now. Why? Because all humans require these. Now, the other thing is this. Cultures change all the time, so you can't program all of behavior in genetics. So the other perceptions start to come from what are called learned habits, and they're stored in the subconscious mind. Learned habit is walking. When you were an infant, you didn't know how to walk. What did you have to do? You learned. You got up. You started to teeter-totter. You could contract your muscles. You started to learn it, and guess what? Today, you walk without thinking. It's not even a thought. It's just like that. I know I'm not the only one when I say this, but sometimes I have people in the car and I start talking to them. I get so engaged in the conversation and I'm talking to them. Well, where's my consciousness when I'm talking to them? I'm talking to them. And then sometimes I look up at the road and go, oh my God, I haven't even looked at the road for the last 10 minutes. But I didn't hit anything and I didn't get stopped. So I was apparently driving the car okay. Who was driving the car? And the answer was, once you learn how to drive the car, it's a programmed behavior. You don't have to be conscious to do it. You can drive down the street and your subconscious with the learned programs will drive the car. Well, just want you to know that the learned programs in the subconscious can be very complex. Your job can be learned and become a habit. And once it's a habit, you can be on the job, doing the job, and thinking about your vacation next week, or thinking about what happened in your life last week. Well, if you're thinking about the future or the past, then who's running the present? The subconscious is running the present. Okay? So we acquire instincts from genetics, and learned habits are stored in the subconscious. And the third level of perception is the conscious mind, which is creative, which is different than the subconscious mind, which is just learned habits. The conscious mind can create new ones. So the conscious mind is really important. So what does all this represent? Genetics are nature. You get that in your nature. I have a nature, in my nature, the ability to pull my hand out of the fire. Okay? My subconscious learned habits, that's nurture. When you're nurtured, that's when you learn how to engage in the appropriate behaviors from experience. So that wasn't in the genes. Important, most important point. Hundreds of years, nature, nurture, nurture, nature, which is more important? I'll tell you the truth. The answer? Consciousness. Reason? Consciousness can override anything you had in your nurture, and now, and I can tell you about it later, is that consciousness can even rewrite your genes. In fact, in cancer, that's probably one of the most likely situations involved. The reality is consciousness is more powerful than either nature or nurture because consciousness can rewrite both of those, and we never talk about it. And the important part is we never talk about it. It's more important than what we do talk about. So let's also go into this issue now then about learning these perceptions, the ones that we get from nurture and nature. And why is it important? In the childhood development, I can break it up into germ cell development, development of sperm and egg before the fertilization process. And then I'm going to talk about conception. Then there's a period called the embryonic period where the cells create an embryo. It doesn't look human yet, but then the fetal period is by the time it actually, when you look at the embryo, it does look human. That's the fetal period. Then there's birth, and then from 6 to 12, and then puberty. And now what I'm going to do is show you this. Where is nature involved in this period? Well, nature is involved with selecting the chromosomes and genes that go into the germ cells, and very active in this embryonic period because the genes are controlling the pattern of a developing embryo. Nature will show itself again around puberty when new genes are expressed for maturation that weren't expressed up to this point. Nature is the inherent genes that you got. What's important is nurture. Nurture, and this is very important, nurture starts before the fertilization process. And then nurture begins from the fetal period on after that. Nurture is important. Why? Simple point. Do you control your nature? Did you control your genes that you got? Yes or no? But nurture is the environment. Can you control the environment or your period or perception of the environment? Then why is it important? Because here and through here, then how you are relating to the child or the germ cells is actually changing the perception of the system. And therefore you have power over that developmental process because nurture is learned. So let's talk about this after this one. Consciousness, and I'm going to show you in EEGs, electroencephalographs, brain function. Consciousness, as we talk about it, is not a primary function of the brain until after 6 years of age. It's very important, and I'll explain why consciousness did not start earlier. I'll explain why. First of all, the important part that occurs where nurture, where you actually have an influence over the development of your child before the child, is called genomic imprinting, meaning this. The parents, or actually the people who develop the sperm and the egg, actually are influencing the selection of the genes in the germ cells even before they're released for fertilization. It's a very important concept. And secondarily, this is behavioral programming because behaviors at this point will alter the gene expression as well. Interesting point, it starts before birth. The parents are influencing genetic expression even at the germ cell development. Relevance? Conscious parenting is a very important understanding. Why? Because you are actually acting as genetic engineers for your own developing child. You are selecting genes in your germ cells and then selecting genes in the fetus by the way you perceive life. I'll explain that. Conscious conception. This is an important understanding. And it goes like this. Long before you're ready to have the baby, you should be thinking about this baby and what you're planning with it. The reason is this. Your perceptions are influencing the germ cells. I'll explain how it works. Inside the cells, there's a nucleus inside the cell, and inside the nucleus are the chromosomes. When we look at the chromosomes, I said there are 23 pairs of these chromosomes. Here's a pair of chromosomes. One of them, obviously, is the maternal chromosome, and one is the paternal chromosome. Each of the chromosomes has thousands of genes on it. So there's 2 sets of genes for everything. One set derived from the mother and one set from the father. So only showing 7 genes. You have 2 A genes, 2 B, 2 C, 2 D, etc. Why? One from the mother, one from the father. Here's an important point. In most biological systems, only one of the pair of genes can be used. You cannot use both genes. So what is happening is there's a process where some of the genes get blanked out and other genes are allowed to express themselves. I have to cancel one set or the other set. I can't express both. So in this case, I knock out the D and E gene in the paternal chromosome. The mother's chromosome will express the D and E. So there's only one gene active for each of these traits. Why is this relevant? Where does this imprinting occur? And it says this. We now know that it starts prior to ovulation in regard to the egg. About 2 months before the egg is ovulated, it's been in an arrested state of development. And then it is activated where it begins the final stages of maturation. It is during this final stages of maturation that an imprint is laid down on which genes are going to be selected. What's the imprint based on? The perception of the parents. The reason is this. There are 2 sets of genes. One in the father, he can imprint some genes in the sperm, and the mother imprints another set and a larger set in the egg. What is the imprinting? The imprinting says, which of the ones should we negate and knock out and so that it's not going to be expressed so the other chromosome provides it? Or which one should I activate? Why is it relevant? And it goes like this. These are 2 genetically identical mice. In mice, mom's genes favor brain over brawn. Here's what the point is. They did an experiment. And in one set, they activated mainly the paternal set of imprinted genes. And in the other set, they activated mainly the maternal imprinted genes. But remember this, there's a combination of both of them, but these are the 2 extremes. And this is an experiment in a laboratory. Why is it important? Because there's 2 completely different sets of development. It doesn't say that this is male or female. That's not. Both males and females have a set of genes from the father and from the mother. In males and females, I can imprint them either way. It doesn't make any difference. What does it show us? When I activate the maternal genes, this is the shape of the embryo I get. When I activate the paternal genes, this is the shape of the embryo I get. What's different? The paternal genes build an organism that can fight. The paternal genes organize an embryo that will thrive in an environment that is threatening, like an inner city environment. The maternal genes offer a whole different set. What's happening here? Paternal genes, big body musculature. Look at the amount of muscles here. But there's a trade-off. In order for me to build this big muscle, I have to make something less. Guess what? Look at the forebrain size. Look at the forebrain size. I trade it off. Look at the hindbrain. Remember? Hindbrain, this is like if I activated the adrenal system, this is the embryo I would get. Remember? The blood goes to the muscles. It would grow the muscles bigger. The hindbrain gets more blood. Why? Because it's going to operate from reflex behavior more. But in this one, the muscle is reduced, and in exchange, the brain is developed. In a supporting, nourishing environment, this is more of the embryo you would develop. If the parents live in a threatening environment that doesn't support their family or their future generations, they will create an embryo that looks like this. The reason is, in that environment, this will survive better than this one will survive. So why is this important? The imprints were laid down just before the fertilization. So it's the attitudes of the parents within the few months before that conception that are selecting an imprint that will determine some very fundamental shapes and characters of their future baby. This brain is half the size of that brain. And why that's important is I will show you 50% of a child's intelligence can be determined by the prenatal environment and preconception environment. It's very important. You can shortchange a child's intelligence 50% by living in fear. You're going to make a child that can fight, but it's going to compromise the intelligence of the child. So that was preconception. After conception, I want to show you this. This is an evolutionary picture. For the first 4 billion years on this planet, there were only single cells. And after 4 billion years of evolution, cells started to get together in a community. Why? And the answer is very simple. If I maximize the intelligence, let's just say that this cell has X amount of intelligence. How much intelligence does this cell have? X. Okay, and if I put them together in a group of 16 of them, which is a colonial organism called gonium, which is different because they live in a colony versus separate from each other. I have 16 cells in here. Each cell has X. So what's the total amount of awareness of the community? 16. And how much awareness does a single cell have? I got you. 16. Why? When you live in a community, you share awareness. You might only be able to have one on your own, but when you live with 15 others, you get to share their awareness. So the purpose of coming together in a community was to expand awareness. Whether it's a single cell coming into a cellular community or a single human coming into a human community, it's the same evolutionary drive. More awareness, greater survival. Well, the relevance about this is very interesting because when they come together to form a community, the word community comes into play where it wasn't there before. Why is it important? A cell community is an organism. Well, I told you that in the beginning of the lecture. I said you're a community of 50 trillion cells approximately making up your body. Why is it important? Catch this. This is the catch sentence. In community, cells defer their own intelligence to follow the central voice. In other words, a community cannot exist if every member in the community does whatever the hell they want to do. A community exists because we work together for a common goal and a common end. So there's a commonality to the thing, a plan that we're all following, a central voice. Why is this relevant? The cells start from a fertilized egg. They form a community. The community is integrated. The community of my cells are integrated. Every cell is intelligent. I already told you that. I could take the cells out of the body, put it in a petri dish. They don't need the body. They're intelligent on their own. But when they're in a community, they must defer their own intelligence and adopt the community's perception. And this is very important because what would happen if a cell pulled out of the community? And the answer would cause a breakup of the community. What is cancer? Cells that are pulled out of the community. Why do you think they pulled out of the community? In most cases because the community wasn't operating very well and the politic of that community was mainly anger. And at some point cells start to pull out and that's when the end of the community begins. You cannot have people pull out of the community. You cannot have your cells decide not to participate in your community. But all cells have an agreement. It's a law. If you're going to have a community, then you must follow the central voice. Where does that central voice come from? The answer, well, the environment shapes the fetal development. The fetus is a community of cells. The environment is what the fetus is perceiving. The environment is perceived, and as the environment is perceived, the cells of the community will adjust to what it perceives. Well, there's an interesting point, because what the fetus is experiencing is the mother's environment. And so as the mother sees the world, the fetus sees exactly what she sees and responds to her emotions and her feelings exactly as she does. Why? How does the fetus survive? It uses the nutrients and stuff from the mother's blood. Well, remember I told you in the beginning, I showed OBGYN checkup. Doctor says, are you giving enough nutrients to the child? Sure, that's cool. But the other thing is this. The blood has more than nutrients in it. The blood has all the coordinating, integrating communication molecules that make the mother's body function and behave. So the fetus is getting the same signals across the placenta. So as the mother experiences something, the fetus experiences why? Same hormones cross the placenta affect the embryo. It's not a bad plan. Reason? It's nature's Head Start program. What's going on in the world? Fetus can't see it. So what does the fetus do? Rely on what the mother experiences. And as the mother experiences, the fetus will adopt and adjust its physiology to respond to what she sees. If she lives in fear, is that going to be growth promoting to the fetus or not? No. It's going to be protection promoting. It's going to change the genetics and the physiology of that fetus so when it's born, it's ready to live in fear. Why? That's survival. So the parents collectively influence the mother's environment. It's the parents that are shaping the genetics and expression of this child by their perception. Conscious pregnancy. It's a very important understanding because it says this. What's going on during the pregnant period? According to OBGYN, all developmental unfolding of genes. Nothing for the mother to worry about. Uh-oh, mistake, wrong picture. We look at an embryo and we think, well, it's an undeveloped, unfinished thing. It's still developing. We look at the embryo's brain, and the common perception and written in books today is that the fetus brain's not really developed. That in fact, even after the baby is immediately born, the brain is not fully developed. It's even been suggested that babies can't even feel pain. Oh, this is a belief system, and that's why, hey, you don't need to anesthetize a baby. You're going to give it a circumcision. Just cut that skin. It won't mean anything. What do you think the baby's screaming for? Oh, because we're constraining it. No. And the reality is the brain is functional through at least halfway through fetal development. It is functional. And therefore, it is not just passive. Two very important books are these books, one by Thomas Verney, the other by David Chamberlain, two brilliant scientists in the field of pre- and perinatal health. These are very important. What they're telling you is, contrary to public opinion that the brain isn't developed, in fact, it is quite developed and quite aware of what's going on. The reason is it's adjusting its biology to that perception of what it experiences. And now to demonstrate this for you, I want to show you a sonogram. And this is a sonogram that was taken in an experimental situation, that the mother was getting a sonogram, and then the father created an argument with the mother, and to observe what happens to the fetus. Now, if the fetus wasn't really paying attention, it wouldn't really care what's going on. Watch this. It's in Italian. You won't understand it. Watch the fetus. I'll play it again a couple of times. I want you to see it. The reason is very important for this. This fetus is aware of this argument and is responding. Watch it jump. These are convulsions of panic and fear. The child, fetus, is already acquiring knowledge of what's going on and is downloading this awareness. So what's going on during the pregnant period between the parents is totally influencing the expression of this child and the future of this child. So rather than our belief that the mother is just providing nutrients, we must add this important fact. She provides information. She provides information about the environment. The reason is it's based on creating a child that's going to survive. And who knows, if all of a sudden you live in a war environment, then maybe you better change the physiology of your child to survive in that environment. That's why nature created the flexible, dynamic unfolding of a child. And it's important for you to understand that your thoughts and your perception while a child is being carried in utero are not just yours, they belong to the child as well. And it will learn from that. So, this article then makes sense. Where health begins, obesity, cancer, heart attack, how your odds are set in the womb. We're now beginning to realize that the prenatal environmental conditions profoundly change the physiology and development of the child. This one is an example about weight. Fetal exposure to stress hormones such as cortisol also may have consequences in adulthood. For one thing, rats and sheep exposed to a stress hormone in the womb are born smaller. Would that make sense? If you're facing a stress hormone, what does it do to growth? Depresses it. When the fetus is exposed to stress hormones, it's born smaller and are more apt to develop higher blood pressure later on than those not exposed to the hormone. A recent understanding reveals higher cortisol levels during fetal development shortchanges the development of the kidney nephrons, which do the filtering. As a result, the child will develop with fewer nephrons and not be able to handle the blood pressure issues that it experiences later in life. So it's really important to understand that the experiences of the parents are altering the whole physiological and genetic expression of their fetus. This one is very important. Heritability of IQ by Bernie Devlin was in Nature. And it says, this is a review, an editorial of the paper, the genetic heritability of IQ remains highly contentious. A new analysis shows that genetic influences may be weaker and prenatal environmental influence is greater than previously appreciated. It has now been demonstrated that intelligence is approximately 48% determined by genes, 52% determined by environment. Meaning, in a completely toxic, noxious environment, you can shortchange the intelligence of your child 50% just by your responding to that environment. Okay? Now, this one is very critical. Bonding and attachment. There's an old story, most of us are familiar with it. Conrad Lorenz, a behaviorist, working with ducks. showed that when the duck eggs hatch, there was a moment where they pick up on whatever is the action figure right there becomes the mother. And so what he said, look, he hatches the eggs with him being present. And after that, the ducks follow him everywhere he goes. He's the mother. It's called imprinting. Guess what? There's the most important identical kind of period in human development. It's an imprinting period. It's a period where the fetus, or not fetus now, it's the neonate, excuse me, within the right after birth and in the next few weeks. It's a very important attachment bonding thing. It's not just between the mother and the child, it's also between the father and the child. And the relevance about this is very important. What is important? Direct eye contact with the child. The reason is the child has a moment window. It's very interesting. At first, an infant can distinguish chimp faces from each other as individuals. We can't do that. It can distinguish human faces as individuals. But a little later in development, just after a couple of weeks, guess what? It can't distinguish the individual difference between chimp faces. It can only distinguish the individual difference between human faces. It's beginning to narrow and focus it down on who is the parent. Reason why. The eye contact and also physical touching is most important, is required to create an attachment bonding. The relevance about it, as I said, the child learns perception. Well, who's it going to learn it from? The one it's attached to. That becomes the teacher. Both parents can be bonding with their child. Reason why, and this is so beautiful, the child is programmed very, very quickly to determine the facial expression of the parents. If the parents are smiling and happy, that means everything is fine. If the parents are shocked or scared or like this, that means something is wrong. Relevance? Watch this if you see infants. When an infant encounters something new in its environment, it is almost, I think it's a genetic program, it's destined to look around and see the parent. The reason is this. When it sees something new, the first thing it will do is check in with the parent. Reason? It will look at the parent's face. If the parent's face is smiling and happy and everything is cool, then the child accepts this perception as being not toxic and okay. However, if the child looks back and the parent's going, like that, that thing that the child was looking at is immediately gauged in its perception device as this is not good. You don't have to teach the child, it's already learning. But the question is this, how many parents are actually observing their kids when they're learning things? Most of them are too busy doing other things. If the child turns around and the parent's not there, then what is going to gauge whether this is a good thing or a bad thing? It's lost. Now it's not very clear. It was designed to learn very quickly by observing the facial character of the parent what was going on. Now here's an important point. If the bonding doesn't occur, then the child will not focus on faces. Actually, we'll start to focus on mouths, more or less. This has been found in 3-year-olds because that's the first time where you can judge autism. An autistic child does not look and recognize its own mother's face or its father's face from anybody else's face. It can't do it. When it looks at a face, all it looks at is sees the mouth. It doesn't even look at the face. Reason? It lost bonding. It doesn't know. And as this book is a very interesting new book by Katie Granju, Attachment Parenting. It's very important and reveals this. This is the scary part. One of the consequences of improper bonding is the child will express the characteristics of attention deficit disorder, meaning the child will not focus on anything in particular. It will just be scanning and will not focus on things. And why is this a problem? Because so much of this bonding hasn't occurred that so many children are expressing it. The problem is that we confuse it with attention deficit disorder. Those are two different things. And the problem is what then happens to these kids is, oh, this child has attention deficit disorder. Give it these drugs, you know, Ritalin or something like that. And the reality is, oh, well, now you've compounded the problem, made it worse. It wasn't attention deficit disorder. It was an attachment disorder that giving the drugs in no way affects this. And in fact, giving the drugs will distort something else. Giving kids neurotropic drugs is probably one of the worst things I can imagine. Why? Well, look, we got to believe that it's a biochemical machine run by genes. If it's not working right, it's not the parent's responsibility, it's just the kid's off. Oh, he's got a chemical imbalance. It's not anything to do with me. Give the kid some Ritalin. Reality is that's another level of our irresponsibility because we have failed to know the importance of the bonding. and we don't pass this on very well as parents. And if we don't bond with our kids, when they grow up, they will not be able to bond with their kids, as I'll explain why in a minute. Importance about this? Duke's University did a study of the kids taking Ritalin. This just tears me apart. And they found, but remarkably, they also found that more than half of the children in the community who were receiving stimulants did not come close to meeting the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit disorder. Reason? Parents get so bewildered that the kid isn't behaving correctly, take him to the doctor right away and say, kid has attention deficit disorder, give it some drugs. Why? It's not my responsibility. Give it the drugs, I don't have to worry about it. And the issue is, we're so fast to say that everything that's not behaviorally correct is a chemical disorder that we immediately prescribe the drugs. 50% or more of the kids taking the drugs don't even have attention deficit disorder. But we're in a society that promotes that irresponsibility on the part of parents. Conscious parenting. Conscious parenting, to me, now this is a really important story. And the reason is each one of these others is additive, but this one becomes very important, and it's so easy to explain why. And I'll show it to you right now. And it works like this. First of all, I'll give you a study. Non-genomic transmission, that means non-genetic. Non-genomic transmission across generations of maternal behavior and stress responses in a rat. Variations in maternal care appear to influence the development of behavioral and endocrine responses to stress in the offspring. Here's what they did. They took, well, first of all, I'll give you a premise. We always thought all organisms less than humans their behaviors were all genetically programmed, especially something as low on the scale as a rat. All of its behaviors, something complex like maternal behavior, must be a genetic program, because who would imagine that rats are learning? Well, it goes like this. You have what are called bad rat mothers and good rat mothers. The bad ones don't take care of the fetuses. They don't groom them. They don't attend to them very much. Not very good mothers. The good mothers are the ones that pay attention and groom and clean and watch after the rat pups. What they did is they took a baby rat from the bad mothers, put it into the litter of a good mother. Take a rat from the good mother, put it into the litter of a bad mother. It's called cross-fostering. Point, when the rats grew up, they mothered their offspring in the exact same manner that they themselves were mothered. Point, the neonate is learning how to be a parent by being parented. The fact is, it's downloaded through an experience. It's an acquired piece of perceptual knowledge that children learn how to be parents by being parented. And propagate this, so how you parent your child, they will naturally parent their child in the same way. It's propagated from one family to the next. Higher up, talk about monkeys. Lately, after a number of years of teaching chimps sign language, what they found in one of the bonobo chimps was that the mother had learned a sign language, and she had her own chimp. And without anybody paying attention to it, the chimp learned the sign language. One chimp learned it from its mother. And it's like, think about that. Once you taught the first chimp the sign language, all other chimps could learn to do the sign language. This was a different one. This is about this chimp here whose mother was taught Japanese script, kanji, K-A-N-J-I. And the name of the game was, on the screen, the kanji, the Japanese letter for different colors would appear. And then there'd be different color swatches. And what the chimp would do was identify the letter and then match it to the color. So the mother learns this. And when she does it successfully, the machine that's doing the training gives her a coin. And with this coin, the mother runs off and there's a vending machine, and she can put the coin in and get her fruit or whatever she wants out of the vending machine. Well, they were teaching the mother all this, and she had this little tiny infant. And what was real interesting about it, at one point, the mother did the job, went over and was getting the coin into the vending machine, and when they weren't looking, the little tiny infant chimp climbed up on the thing, pressed the right letter, pressed the right color, got the coin, and went to the vending machine. And the important understanding about it is this. We now recognize that all the behaviors that are expressed by chimps all over Africa, they have their own cultures. Cultures represent acquired learning. And the question about where did that acquired learning come from? And as it says right in here, It suggests from this observation that infants pick up such skills solely by observation and don't have to be actively coached by the parents. Aha! What does that mean? That the infants are observing every one of your moves and they're downloading it for just what it is. No question, no coaching, watching you as a parent all of the time with their eyes and brains open to observe how you respond to the stimulus, what behavior you do, and they learn the stimulus response by just observation. No teaching, observation. And all of a sudden it says, my goodness, then you recognize that as you're walking around and talking and doing all these things, that this little infant that you think is like half the brain is only developing is like fully recording everything you're saying and doing. But you also know that. You know when the word comes up, or those little swear words come out of your little baby's mouth, and you go, where'd you learn that? Well, obviously, from you. But you know what's more funny about it, if you think about it? When they use these curse words, they use them so appropriately. Why? They learned all the nuances they were learning. So here's an important understanding. And it deals with electroencephalograph activity. And it works like this. From before birth to 2 years of age, a child will express predominantly delta activity, which is very low frequency brain activity. When we express that, we're essentially sleeping or not being conscious. Okay? And it doesn't mean the child's unconscious, like knocked out. The child is totally present, but not engaged in what's going on. It's seeing it, observing it, and downloading it, but doesn't like interfere with the download, doesn't say, gee, that was a good behavior, that was bad behavior. It just watches you and learns the behavior. It's not being consciously involved in the learning. Then from 2 until 6, the brain activity raises a notch into what is called theta. This is like imagination state, twilight reverie, when you're waking up and you're half asleep and half awake and you're mixed between the two. That's theta. Theta for kids is the imagination period. From 2 to 6, that's where all the imaginary games and all the imaginary play is coming from. They're in this period. After 6, they start to express more predominantly alpha, which is consciousness. And by 12, they're beginning to express beta, which is active, focused consciousness. What's the relevance of this? The relevance is up till 6 years of age, they're in delta and theta. Delta and theta is called the hypnagogic state. If I want to hypnotize you, I have to drop you from alpha into delta and theta. Reason? I can download information without you being involved with it. That is what hypnosis is all about. Relevance? Until 6 years of age, the child is in a hypnotic state. Everything you say and do, it's learning, it's watching, it's observing. Until then, until 6, at that point it begins to express its own consciousness, which can still make programs, but then it's involved with the program. Up till 6 is the most important period. The reason is this. This is the period of enculturation. This is the period where the child has to learn all of the details about language and movement and how to integrate into society. This is the developmental period of learning how to be a part of a community. And why consciousness is not involved is it would distort the downloading of this information. So in this time period, the child is completely a tape recorder of all of the behavior it observes from the teachers called its parents. And all of a sudden, you start to recognize a very important problem that's going to happen here, and that is then you were also programmed between 2 and 6 to have behaviors, and you weren't consciously involved with your own programming. And these are fundamental programs. By the time a child is 6, the parents could be gone. The child will still grow up just like the parents were. Isn't it the Jesuits that said, you give me a child till he's 6 or 7 and he belongs to the church after that the rest of his life? Why? They already knew. I could program it by 6 and after that it belongs to the church. And the reality is, this is important because the child is observing everything you're doing. And then why is this relevant? Well, look at it this way. The mind. What is the mind? Well, there's 2 parts to the mind we talk about. The subconscious mind is the original brain. Consciousness is a much higher level than like primates and higher primates and humans. For example, we can talk about consciousness. But below that, all the brains are just subconscious. What is subconscious? Very fast processing, 4 billion pieces of information every second. The brain is downloading and responding to 4 billion pieces of data a second. It's very fast, but here's the issue of the subconscious. It's totally habitual. What is in the subconscious is habit. Once it's learned, it will always play the same habit over and over and over again. Subconsciousness is not consciousness. Consciousness is creative. Subconsciousness are tapes. Where did you get the tapes? Your subconscious was programmed before birth up through 6 years of age without you even being involved. You learned tapes about how to live. After you get past 6, this development of the prefrontal cortex region here, which is where our central source of consciousness comes from, self-consciousness, self-reflection, is an add-on, really. And as a matter of fact, it's an option. A lot of people in this world don't even use consciousness. The reason is you don't need it. I'll give you an example. Once somebody is programmed, and in the old days, remember, people had neurological defects, they'd give them a lobotomy. Lobotomy would cut out this part of the brain. They would lose this. Guess what? They'd essentially carry on with the rest of their lives. Why? Once you learn the program, it's just repetition. Where's your consciousness in most of your life when you're thinking about it? When you're doing day-to-day things, is your consciousness really focused on the task, or is your consciousness frequently thinking about other things? If your consciousness is thinking about other things, get what that means. If your consciousness is engaged with what happened last week or your vacation next month, then whatever you are doing at that time, right at that moment, is not being run by consciousness, it's being run by subconscious. Relevance? When you are not paying attention to your own consciousness, you are playing tapes that are not even yours. And you don't even see it, because the subconsciousness works imperceptibly. It's so fast that it doesn't even engage consciousness. Give you an example. I can wire you up with electrodes to your fingers and then show you a slideshow on the screen. Show you a happy slide, and your physiology will go under a physiological response for happiness and health and growth. Show you a scary slide, and you'll automatically go into a protection mode, a whole different aspect. Here's the point. I can show you a slide so fast, click, click, that you consciously did not see that. And you know what? Your subconscious saw it and engaged in the behavior, and your consciousness didn't even see it. It's called subliminal. What's the point? Well, when you're walking down the street, which is further out in front, consciousness or subconsciousness? Subconsciousness. Reason why? It's scanning 4 billion bits of data in the environment instantaneously and downloading a behavior that your consciousness didn't even see yet. And the behavior that it elicits, is it your behavior? Not necessarily. Could be the behavior you were programmed with. Relevance? You didn't even see it, and you're already engaged in behavior, and it's not even your behavior. And the problem about that is this is where conscious parenting runs adrift here. And the reason is this. I can be conscious and be a good parent as long as I'm conscious. But the moment I'm not paying attention, what behavior am I expressing? Mine or the one I was programmed with? And if the child is watching that, is it watching my conscious parent role, or is it watching the behavior that I'm expressing when I'm not being conscious? Why is that important? Because if it's watching the behavior when you're not being conscious, it's not even watching your behavior. It's watching the program that you got from your parents. And all of a sudden you see the disconnect. Yes, I'm consciously wanting to be a good parent, but the moment I'm not being conscious, the behavior I engage in is not mine either. I'll give you an example if you can see how it works. So it's like a dialogue. Okay, in my conscious mind, I'm talking to you. And in my conscious mind, I might be saying to you, geez, I don't understand why people don't like me. I'm such a lovable person. I try so hard, and I'm trying to be such a good person. And then while I'm talking to you and giving you the story, someone yanks on my shirt back here, right? And this is my behavior. Watch. And I don't know why people don't like, damn it, don't yank on my shirt when I'm talking to these people. Hi. I don't know why people don't like me. And the reason is you don't see that behavior. This behavior that happened back here was not visible. It was a tape. It played. It was a stimulus response. It had no engagement of consciousness. You don't need consciousness. All you need are the stimuli. Relevance about being a conscious parent, then, is to recognize we must really go back and look at our own behaviors, because our own behaviors might not be reflecting what we consciously would like them to be. And, interestingly enough, these are self-sabotaging. The reason is this. The central voice controls the cells. The central voice. But if the central voice is a tape from somebody else, then you're being controlled by somebody else's opinion. And the cells cannot override the central voice. It's not in the program. Relevance? If I am programmed by my child, my father, excuse me, if I am programmed by my father when I'm a child, and he says to me, you don't deserve it, you don't deserve it, you're not good enough, you don't deserve it. He says this on a few occasions. What am I downloading? I'm downloading a belief about what? I am not good enough. That's a tape. It's not my consciousness. It's not me thinking I'm good enough or not good enough. It's a tape. I just learned it. Why is it relevant? I grow up now. I'm going to go to school, and I say, there's a track team. And I say, cool, I want to run on the track team. And guess what? I go out to run, and my first race, I'm actually in front of everybody. And the finish line's up there. And as I approach the finish line, I'm having a conflict. The conflict is this. My consciousness said, yeah, let's run the race. My subconsciousness has a program, not good enough. If I pass the finish line and win, I violate the central voice. Guess what? My subconscious will force me or cause me to trip, and I will think it was an accident. Everybody in the stands that watched me thought, oh my God, he tripped, what an accident. It wasn't an accident, it was required, because if I cross the finish line, I violate the tape. There's a great movie called Shine, and it's a true story about an Australian piano player, David Helfgott. His father, a Holocaust survivor, grew up in the Holocaust situation, survived, and his programming to his child was this: do not stand out. If you stand out, they will see you. If they see you, they will get you. Therefore, be a nothing. Be blending in there, be nothing. That was his programming before 6 years of age. After that, he started getting consciousness, and he started to learn how to play the piano, and he was really good at it. And this is a true story, so the movie is really interesting in this regard. He finally is so good, he gets into piano competition, and it's the best piano player in Australia competition. He picks the hardest piece, a Rachmaninoff piece to play. He's in the middle of playing it, and if you see the movie, in the middle of playing it, he's really going good, and all of a sudden, he starts to get fuzzy, and he's out of body. And what was happening was, his subconscious was trying to throw him out, saying, if you succeed, we're dead. That was the program. So the program was not to succeed. And he kept forcing to stay conscious and play it through. And if you see the movie, it's like in and out, in and out. And right near the end, I mean, he's just about out, and he plays the last note, and he wins. He passed out. He passed right out on the piano, right there. He played the last note, passed out on the piano. When he woke up, he was totally insane. Reason? You cannot force a change in the tape. Now, good news, you can change the tapes, but you can't force them to change. How many have tried New Year's resolutions? You know, my New Year's resolution, New Year's morning, I'm cutting back on food, I'm not going to eat a lot, and I'm going to get more exercise. By lunchtime, when the turkey was done and all the food was on the table, that thing was out the window. I was already back into the other program. You cannot force changes, but please let me tell you this. You can change these. You can change any programming. Consciousness can override nurture any time, but you need to do it with a process. You just can't do it. It's a process of change. Okay? I'll close off with this. Educational resources and referrals. I want to provide you with 2 organizations that will give you all the referrals you need about changing programs, all of nature steps of conscious conception, conscious pregnancy, conscious parenting. And these are the Association for Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology and Health, APA. This is the website, tremendous resources. And this one is called the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children, another website. And why these are important is you can download from these organizations details about the things that I talked about today, plus processes that can be used in creating a better relationship with your children, a better understanding of parenting. And in this process, the whole nature of it is very important for this reason. That is, that how we parent our children is how they will parent their children. How we parent our children today changes the future of evolution on this planet. And therefore, our own children are the future parents. And therefore, it is really incumbent upon us to recognize that we have an active, dynamic role in making a much better world. But but we have to get out of our own old belief systems to do it. And to recognize we are not genetically determined, but we are actually influenced in every step of the way from before conception through development and childhood, how we influence our kids, and we can make superstars out of them with consciousness. Without consciousness, we're probably doomed in this regard. And yet I know when you understand all this information and the new biology is manifesting itself, the future of the world is open for a much healthier, happier, loving environment for all of us. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.